It's decision day in several communities across Massachusetts, where the polls will soon be closing for preliminary elections, including a number of mayoral races in Somerville, Brockton, Newton, Framingham, among others, and of course, in Boston, where an historic field of Democrats will be narrowed down to 2. Earlier today, all 5 made their final pitches to voters on Boston Public Radio.
I'm the candidate for mayor that is most ready to hit the ground running and make the changes that Bostonians want to see in our city. We can get it done together.
I am ready to lead this city. I look forward to leading this city, and I hope to do it in partnership with the people of Boston. I've lived the very inequities we're talking about, but I'm more than a lived experience. I come with a significant record of accomplishment on creating more affordable housing, improving our Boston public schools, dealing with the opioid crisis in the city of Boston.
We've done amazing work together over the last 5 months. It's very clear that we cannot go back to the way things were. It's important that we take this opportunity to make sure we are creating a stronger Boston together.
I know the gaps in Boston, but I also have a decade of experience in City Hall, knowing how to get things done and knowing how much is possible if we bring people together to confront our deepest challenges.
It's been a tight race for weeks, and there are plenty of people watching, not just in Boston, but across the country. Joining me to discuss are Adrian Walker, columnist for the Boston Globe, and GBH News reporter Adam Riley. Adam, Adrian, thanks so much for being here.
Hey, Jim.
Adrian, let me start with you. The mayors of Boston, I assume everybody knows, have always been white men. Regardless of who the 2 finalists are tonight, ultimately the people will have elected a person of color for the first time. What does that fact in and of itself mean for Boston, for the people of Boston?
I think that fact in and of itself is enormous for Boston. You know, I remember working on the Spotlight series on race in 2017. And at that point, Boston was one of the few major cities in America that had only ever elected white men as mayors. So, I mean, this is a historic moment, no matter how it plays out. And I think it's a really big deal.
I want to get back to your Spotlight work in a minute, but does it matter who the finalists are? I mean, there are 3 black candidates, Adrian, in this race. It's not inconceivable that we could go to bed tonight with none of them having made the final, that Wu and Essaibi George could be the finalists. How would that affect the calculus?
Well, if that happens, and it is plausible, I mean, that's going to be an enormous disappointment, particularly to an entire generation of black political activists. And it could happen. But regardless, I think we are at a moment where you're seeing the city's politics change dramatically in a way that will never go back.
Do you think, Adam, do you agree with Adrian's last thought that things have changed dramatically, even if none of the black candidates make the final?
I would say I agree that this field is an indication of a big and pretty seismic change that's been brewing for a while. But I am already bracing myself for what the national media narrative is going to be if it is a Wu and Essaibi George final. If you had, as you said, Jim, 3 black candidates not make it through, including the acting mayor, who received a ton of national attention for becoming the first black woman to lead the city at length, I think a lot of people who might not know the finer grain points of this contest will look and say, well, there you go. Boston did it again. They wouldn't elect a black mayor. That might not be a fair takeaway, but I think that's the claim that a lot of people will come to if that's the outcome.
If we can stay on that note for a second, Adrian, I actually was dying to talk to you months and months ago when you wrote a piece about the effort to rally behind one black candidate. And you talked about it as ugly politics, were your words. And when I read it, I said I nodded in agreement. And then I said to myself, but everybody I know thinks it would have been fine if in the race to succeed Joe Kennedy, the progressives had all united behind one candidate with the notion that Jake Auchincloss, the ultimate winner, was more moderate. So let's say behind Jesse Mermel, just for example, so that the progressives didn't split their votes. So why were so many people saying that was okay, but the effort to unite behind one black candidate was not?
See, this analogy, I'm not sold on this analogy. Let's remember that Campbell was in this race before Marty Walsh even decided to leave. She's a former city council president with every credential and every right to run. And I didn't think she should have to get out of this race to make way for Kim Janey, which, to be clear, is what people were actually calling for. I think she had a right to stay in the race and run the race. I think she's run a good race. And, it plays out the way it does.
But if it had not been a pro-Janey effort, according to you, but had rather been a unite around one candidate effort, would you have felt differently?
I don't know if I would have felt differently or not, but my fundamental feeling is that, everybody who wants to run should run, everybody who's qualified, and things should play out the way they do. For example, when Rachel Rollins ran for DA a few years ago, there was the same undercurrent that, the other progressives should get out and they should rally behind Rollins. Instead, Rollins ran a great campaign and beat everybody.
So, Adam, Adrian thinks my analogy stinks. Do you think the same thing or no?
Naturally, as a supportive colleague, I'm more favorable when it comes to your analogy. But I do think, and obviously, I'm saying this as a white man, I think there's something problematic about the assumption that because you check off a particular demographic box, you therefore can be expected to vote a certain way. And that it's almost deterministic. I was talking with our colleague, Kelly Crossley, this afternoon about the race, and she was saying that the flawed premise of the Wakanda 2 argument, that was the Diane Wilkerson-led campaign to get people to unite behind one black candidate. The flawed premise of that is that there is a black vote, as opposed to a very complex vote consisting of different populations of black people in the city of Boston. And I think she's right about that. Now, that being said, again, I'm talking out of both sides of my mouth because I really am worried about not just what the national takeaway will be if no black candidate makes it through, but what the local takeaway might be as well.
I want to dwell for one more minute, Adrian, if I can, on the national takeaway. That terrific Spotlight series you and your colleagues did in 2017 about racism in Boston currently as opposed to historically also had a poll that was done in it where black Americans were asked about which was the least welcoming of 8, I believe it was 8 major American cities. And Boston topped or bottomed the list, the least welcoming. How that changes is a function of who the 2 finalists are, is it not?
Absolutely it is. And I think Adam's right about what the national narrative will be. I mean, this is what MSNBC will be saying tomorrow. Boston had a black acting mayor and she lasted a few months and, voters, moved on.
Adrian, today I was talking to Egan and I were talking to Adam on the radio. And one of the things that was disappointing to me is that Bill Galvin was the Secretary of State, who usually is pretty good at making predictions about turnout, suggested the turnout in this election would be lower than the 2013 election that ultimately led to the Marty Walsh becoming mayor. I haven't spoken to anybody who doesn't think, to do a double negative, that this is an incredibly talented field of 5 people. Why are voters not responding in greater numbers?
I think there's a certain amount of general political fatigue. I think we're in the middle of a pandemic still. I think it's competed for attention with things like the start of school, and it has not galvanized voters in the way that one might have hoped.
Are you buying that thesis, Adam Riley?
Well, I do think that the pandemic fatigue piece is very real, but there's this longstanding dishonorable tradition in the city of Boston of not that many people caring enough to actually get to the polls. The turnout in the preliminary election in 2013, when there was another really impressive field, and in the end, Marty Walsh and John Connolly got to the final, Walsh came out on top. The turnout in that prelim was 30%. So Galvin is saying it's going to be under 30%, under a third of people who are registered voters in Boston caring enough to come out to vote. And I do think it's kind of dispiriting because while the political fatigue that Adrian talks about is very, very real, here the residents of Boston get to pick someone who has incredible power in terms of shaping all aspects almost of their lived experience as Boston residents. And I would want to cast that vote if I had it.
So would I. Hey, I want to quote you again to you, if I may, Adrian, about how people are deciding this race. Right before the 2 debates, one of which, the BUR Globe debate, where you were one of the moderators, you wrote, "Debates are seldom decisive, but these clearly have the potential to be." Were they? Is this a race about issues, or is it more about personal connections, identity? How are people deciding who they're voting for here?
It's always a little of all of the above. But one thing about this race is that these are really substantive candidates with a lot to say on the issues, which is not, by the way, always the case. So I think that, where they are on issues like who's going to be able to afford to live in the city, housing issues, transportation issues, other things are really important in a way that they aren't always.
But as important as they may be, can the average voter, even he or she who is taking their responsibility as a voter seriously, that somewhere near 30%, can that average voter tell the differences on the issues that matter to them most?
You're talking about a race where 2, 3, and 4 could be 3 or 4 points, could be separated by 3 or 4 points if the polls are to be believed. Could it make a difference in a race that tight? Yes.
Do you
I believe
think,
it could.
is this an issues-driven race for most voters, Adam Riley?
I think it's a combination of the two, and I think it depends to an extent on the candidate that we're talking about. You can, I think, draw some pretty clear distinctions between the various candidates. You can say Andrea Campbell is the most aggressive when it comes to police reform. You can say Michelle Wu is the most aggressive when it comes to the environment. You can say Annissa Essaibi George is the one who's most reluctant to change the way the police operate similarly. But we hear a lot about all these candidates' biographies, right? That's been a staple for all of them. Maybe Wu marginally less than the others, but they all spend plenty of time talking about who they are, where they came from, what their lived experiences are, how that'll inform their approach when they govern. So I'll argue that it's a mix and a fairly equal mix.
You know, Adrian, I read a piece in your paper this morning by James Pendle talking about 3 issues or things or people who really weren't major parts of this campaign, proving once again that my powers of prediction are non-existent. I thought this debate would in great part be about the legacy of Walsh. Who does Walsh support? Which of the candidates is with Walsh? Who's not? Walsh was virtually a non-presence in the debates and discussions of the candidates in this race, was he not, and why?
Yeah, and it's one of the things that I found to be really interesting. I mean, in a sense, Essaibi George is the inheritor of sort of the coalition of union and, working class white voters that elected Walsh. But Walsh himself as a personality and his legacy has not been much of a presence in this race at all. And I think it says something, frankly, about the small footprints he seems to have left as he leaves the office.
That's very interesting. Well, you'd also know Essaibi George went out of her way, as I would have if I were in her campaign, to announce that Walsh's mother was not only voting for her, but I think that she was taking her to the polls to vote for her. Okay, so I don't know if you want to do this, but it's 7 o'clock. The polls are closing in 45 minutes. Starting with you, Adrian, who makes the final?
Wu and Essaibi George.
Wu and Essaibi George. How about you, Adam Riley? Who you think will make it? Not who you want to make it. Who do you think will make it?
Everyone's going to think I'm copying Adrian. I'm not, but I'm going to make the same prediction. Wu, I think, has had a clear path for a while, and the turnout numbers all day have shown really big numbers coming out in the city's more conservative wards and precincts. So I'll second Adrian's prediction.
Adrian Walker, I really appreciate your time. Adam Riley, you as well. Gentlemen, thanks so much for being here.
Thanks so much.
Thank you, Jim.